Now to this evening's presentation. It's my great pleasure to introduce formally Professor Alison Bashford, who will address us tonight on the subject of the intimate history of evolution, the Huxleys, 1825 to 1975. Alison is a laureate professor of history at the University of New South Wales and director of the Laureate Centre for History and Population and honorary fellow at Jesus College in Cambridge. Elected to our society in 2017, Alison is a leading scholar of global history, environmental history, and the history of science. She is recognised for her expertise on imperial medicine, gender history, and the intellectual history of environmentalism in empire. Alison was awarded the Royal Society of New South Wales History and Philosophy of Science Medal in 2020 and the Dan David Laureate Prize in 2021. She is a Fellow of the British Academy and the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and I refer you to the agenda for this meeting for a much longer biography that is well worth reading. Her lecture tonight is being presented as the Society's contribution to this year's National Science Week, albeit slightly early. As I mentioned, Robert Clancy will conduct the Q&A and he will probably introduce himself, but I will say that given his record of the books that he has written, he is the perfect person to conduct the Q&A when Alison has finished her presentation. So welcome, Alison.
Thank you very much indeed for that generous welcome, and lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I just scrolled through the attendees, and hello to many friends there. Lovely to be able to talk to you about this extraordinary family, the Huxley family. A dynasty with whom I've lived for some time now, and my book on this family will come out early next year, all going well, with Penguin in London. So it's a book about a family with considerable Australian connection, and it's a scientific dynasty, as many of you will know, of extreme eminence, starting from very modest roots. And of many people in the Huxley family, the pair that I've become increasingly interested in pairing is the patriarch of the family, Thomas Henry Huxley, here in the painting, and this is his grandson, Julian Huxley. There are many other Huxleys, maybe we'll talk about them in our questions, but I've become very interested in pairing these two, this grandfather and grandson. It's not a relationship, grandfather and grandson, that often gets discussed in historical circles, in biographies for that matter, nor often in science histories. Well, here they are, the two of them, in 1947, and they're in Julian Huxley's library in Hampstead, and there he is posing for a photo shoot for Life magazine. Life featured the Huxley family, the grandfather, this grandson, and his brother Aldous Huxley, for a really nice feature they wrote in 1947. Well, here's Julian Huxley. He's very self-consciously arranging himself in front of a portrait of his grandfather, and well may he do so. Over the 19th and 20th century, these two life scientists, they were really self-appointed cosmologists, really large thinkers. They communicated to the world the great modern story of evolution. And for Julian in particular, that meant communicating the birth of the idea of natural selection, the death of the idea of natural selection around 1900, really at its low point, and then its rebirth in the 1920s to 1940s. I like to think of them as trustees of evolution, and that's a phrase that Julian Huxley used often to describe all of humankind. We are all trustees of evolution, he would often say. But for me, it's become very useful to apply that, I think, quite neatly to the Huxleys themselves. Well, this younger man here, Julian Huxley, here he is in 1947, and he constantly fashioned himself after his very famous grandfather. He grafted himself to signature Huxley knowledge quests, and some of these were really very profound at the beginning of Darwinian ideas. Other Huxley knowledge quests were simply grandiose, something that the family also specialised in. These two men really were remarkable, but they were also both on occasion very tortured. They both suffered very seriously from mental ill health. And in my study of them, and I hope the editor will agree to call this book An Intimate History of Evolution, as I've called this lecture, because I want to write not just about these men as scientific thinkers, but as scholars of evolution and especially inheritance. They were both intellectually interested in, but also suffered from what they knew was inherited from one generation to another. Well, for me then, as a historian of the 19th and 20th century world, putting these two men together permits what I think of as a kind of a time lapse over these centuries, precisely because they were so similar. And sometimes in my research, and even as I write and talk about them, I think of them as one very long-lived man. Vital dates, 1825 all the way to 1975, the birth of Thomas Henry to the death in 1975 of Julian Huxley. And if we think about these dates, 1825 to 1975, what the Huxleys together are useful for me in as anchoring is a study of colossal shifts in world history over that period. These dates bookend the age of sail to the space age. They bookend wars, from colonial wars to the World War, right through both world wars to the Cold War. They bookend a time when the Earth was 6,000 years old, according to Genesis, to a time when it was 4.5 billion years old at least, according to rock samples returned from Apollo missions around the time that Julian died. And so on one measure, I like to think of this period as an age of evolution, and these were two really key players that came after the age of revolution, of the French and American revolutions. Well, here they are. Let me summarize for you. Some of you will be very familiar with them, but let me summarize their lives and their work. Here's T.H. Huxley, born 1825 and he died in 1895. And he was the patriarch very much of this scientific dynasty. He was, at his peak, he was one of the world's best known zoologists and comparative anatomists. And many of you will recognize him as dogged promoter and defender of Charles Darwin in the very earliest public disputes over the theory of evolution by natural selection. Well, Huxley was up for that fight, no question about it. He sought that fight over evolution, he enjoyed it, and he won it. And in that process, his professional life was one long fight. In that process, he challenged British established power structures of all kinds, but most especially the Church of England. Thomas Henry Huxley was raised outside London, and then as a fairly young boy moved with a kind of downwardly spiraling family financially to the Midlands in the 1840s. This was the Chartist Midlands. He was never bestowed his position, never bestowed his position as Professor of Paleontology and natural history at what was then called the Royal School of Mines, that what became Imperial College London. Every inch of the way he fought for it, from very modest roots. He retained a lifelong favour of merit-based rewards and effort-based achievement. He was one long-lived opponent of inherited authority and position. And this stance for him was explicit and political, often bitter, often antagonistic. But it really rocket fueled his battles against conventions and against authorities and against all kinds of orthodoxies, primarily probably scientific orthodoxies, rather than what people sometimes remember him as the agnostic who challenged religious orthodoxies. So it's very important to place him in the middle of the 19th century when there's deep challenge over kinds of evolution, deep challenge, of course, over natural selection specifically, deep challenge over taxonomies. Together with a close circle of like-minded friends, he drove what was called scientific naturalism in the middle of the 19th century. And that was a scientific understanding of nature that held no place for anything beyond natural or supernatural. No creation, no supernatural force or origin will serve to explain nature. That's scientific naturalism. He was both self-made and he was self-satisfied. He's a fantastic biographical figure to write about, very self-satisfied, especially with his fights with the world. He was a really big personality. He was bold and fractious, and he was enormously impressed with himself, so much so that he greeted himself every time he climbed up these stairs to go to bed at home. His house was filled with images and representations of himself. Well, there's one of them. This is the three generations. It's a moment when high Victorian science, represented by Thomas Henry Huxley here, and Victorian letters were conjoined when his son here with the moustache, Leonard Huxley, married Julia Arnold. And Julia Arnold came from the literary family Thomas Arnold, the poet Matthew Arnold, and the novelist Mary Augusta Ward, née Arnold. There's young Julian. He was the first surviving child, born in 1887, and that means that he crossed vital dates with his grandfather for a few important years. And Julian there is the first surviving son, and then there is Trevennan, thereafter Aldous Huxley, the famous novelist and essayist, and a younger sister, Margaret, the four of them. Well, here, Julian's future great science is being heralded because he was very much a beneficiary of his grandfather's fights in scientific and educational fields. There really was a great rise in the family fortune, which saw Julian and his two brothers, actually, including Aldous, at Eton and then at Balliol College, Oxford. And I should say that the extraordinary thing about Thomas Henry Huxley, people sometimes imagine him as well-to-do and independently wealthy as Charles Darwin was. But in fact, nothing of the sort was the case. He came from very modest background. He went to school for about 2 years, left at about 11, and was a medical apprentice from the time he was 13, soon in the very grim 1840s East End of London, and thereafter self-transformed into a natural scientist. But his son and then his grandson kind of benefited from his fights and his rising fortunes, and they are Eton and then Balliol educated. And there's, I think, an amazing photo of young Julian Huxley at Eton College, young student, boarding there, as you can see, not especially happy. And he was a very confessional writer, Julian Huxley, and there's quite a lot of material on his very difficult time at Eton. And of course, he's not alone in that matter. When he went to Oxford, he went to Balliol College, Oxford, and there natural sciences, this is about 1906, natural sciences had completely transformed, unsurprisingly, from his father's and his grandfather's time. Julian Huxley learned at Oxford evolutionary theory that was a matter of course, not a matter of controversy. But, and this is really important, he also studied around 1906 to 1908, 1909, a then strong critique amongst scientific discontents, not religious discontents, about natural selection specifically. So a technical problem with Darwinian natural selection was something that Julian Huxley helped resolve in the 1920s through 1940s, with probably his magnum opus, which he called Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, which is a 1942 book, I believe, that brought Darwinism and Mendelism together in what he called the modern synthesis. Well, in a really remarkable turnaround, and one that we can actually put down to larger than life H.G. Wells, I can talk about that later if you wish, Julian Huxley traded in an academic career in zoology, and he was doing quite well, first at Oxford, then Rice University in Texas, and then back to King's College London to a professorship. He gave it all up. He gave it all up for what we would now call science communication. And he went on to become, there he is, the scientist, there he is, the writer. He went on to become really an adventurous communicator in all kinds of media that were unimaginable to his grandfather, in broadcasting, in film, and eventually in early television. And he even won an Oscar for a short nature documentary in the early 1930s, I think it was. The best way to explain Julian Huxley and his then fame in the world is to understand him as an early David Attenborough. And in so many ways he's David Attenborough's antecedent, but really more than that. Julian Huxley is not just an antecedent to David Attenborough, he's actually an early mentor, because it was Julian Huxley who early experimented with that strange new genre, the nature documentary. It's Huxley from the late 20s, early 30s, this is why what he won an Oscar for in a film called, it's an amazing film actually, called The Private Life of the Gannet, the water bird filmed on an island off the Welsh coast. That's what he won an Oscar for, right through the 1950s. In the 1950s, David Attenborough's very first ventures into the genre, in fact, have Julian Huxley in front of the camera and narrating, and David Attenborough, the producer, behind the camera. So this is not just a kind of a Julian Huxley as antecedent, but very much as a mentor for Attenborough's work, and actually someone who nurtured and not solely created, but was right at the center of the creation of an appetite for that new genre, which is of course now so successful. So really David Attenborough was learning from the then master. Well, along the way then, and I have to say in between really paralyzing depressions that I'll come to, Julian Huxley was quite a controversial secretary of the London Zoo in Regent's Park in the late 30s and through the war years. He was equally controversial Director General of UNESCO in the late 1940s. He always said he put the S in UNESCO, science, of course. And he was an A-list speaker across the world in the 1950s and 60s about mainly about global, the acceleration of global population and population control in this catastrophic era when, and I can't emphasize this enough, this is a period when the end of the world seemed imminent between the population bomb and the atomic bomb. That's the kind of catastrophic genre and the catastrophic kind of world politics that drove Julian Huxley onto a very large stage. Well, the grandfather, oh, there's a nice image that I just found actually of him in Australia broadcasting his wisdom through the ABC. Well, the grandfather invented the term agnostic, and this grandson followed through with his own term, the term transhumanism. Especially Julian was highly political in a really a remarkable era when many natural scientists were just that. If we think about, I mean, this is an era when more natural scientists of Julian's generation were members of the British Communist Party than weren't. This is a really peculiar, sometimes quite hard to understand generation where there was a drive behind a lot of biologists that connected very much to all kinds of political questions, not just about humans, but largely so. Julian inhabited exactly that sphere. He offered key public statements about the human species, human difference, human variation. He was an anti-fascist signatory to the so-called Geneticist Manifesto from 1939. That was a manifesto published in Nature. I think there are about 23 signatories in all that opposed Nazi racial dogma. He was an early driver of UNESCO's statement on race, an anti-racist statement on race, much written about. He was very much trying to create a new world after fascism and after the Holocaust. He was president, though, alongside all of that, he was also president of the British Eugenics Society. And that apparent contradiction, in fact, was quite reconcilable in his own intellectual ecosystem, if I can put it that way, and we can come to that. So there are two scientific lives for you. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about these two as zoologists. I'll then go briefly to their really interesting way in which they are not just players in a 19th and 20th century story of secularization, but they're almost authors of it, care of inventing the term agnostics. But there's a bit of a surprising history there about how we put science and religion and Darwinism together. And then I'll talk a little bit about Julian Huxley's really role in eugenics. Well, evidence as to man's place in nature. Most of you will know this image at the top. It's the frontispiece, not a good reproduction of the frontispiece of T.H. Huxley's probably best known study, the book Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature, 1863. And it's misread often. And once you kind of log into this, it's kind of hilarious watching the constant misreadings of this image. So at the top, we have the frontispiece of Evidence of Man's Place in Nature, which is in fact straightforward comparative anatomy, 1860s style of different kinds of primate skeletons. Homo sapiens, human at the end, going backwards, gorilla, I can't even remember, and gibbon with the very long arms at the beginning. It's actually, so it's a comparative anatomy. It has no time access to it whatsoever. It's comparing primate skeletons in the present, which is what he did as day-to-day business as a comparative anatomist. But kind of hilariously, it constantly gets misread as evolution over time. And here's just one of those images. So it's recapitulated all the time, where new commentators on evolution take this famous image, recast it as if it's the story of evolving primates, so it's not at all. These are from gibbon to human in his 1863 present. But by the time Thomas Henry Huxley wrote this famous book and became really embroiled in Darwinian conversations, ideas about evolution after Origin of Species, after 1859, before that, in fact, he'd created his career as a zoologist with all kinds of invertebrates, actually. He went on probably only one major, what we would now call research field trip. Only one major experience as a zoologist in the field, and that was a very long journey in the 1840s to the Pacific. And this is where he really cut his teeth as a natural scientist, although he was actually on the ship, not as a natural scientist at all, but as the assistant surgeon on the HMS Rattlesnake, Royal Navy ship. And all the way from Rio to New Guinea, up and down the east coast of Australia, round the Torres Strait, the Louisiana archipelago to New Guinea. The Rattlesnake's voyage, it ranged for Thomas Henry Huxley from, and we have very detailed diaries, it ranged from becalmed boredom to deep melancholy, to an unbearable lovesickness for his Sydney-based beloved. Her name was Henrietta Hawthorne. They met in the late 1840s in Sydney. And so for all of, there's a very Sydney conversation here where all of Thomas Henry Huxley's, all of the Rattlesnake's kind of base point was Sydney, and it would go on long cruises from there. That's where he met Henrietta Hawthorne, and they married much later in London. Along the way, in all of these cruises, he saw amazing animals of the Pacific and of the Australian oceans and of the New Guinean oceans and lands, dugongs and starfish and marsupials and tropical birds of colours and sizes that, even with his great artistic skill, he could never quite catch in his watercolour on parchment. But it was the unlikely jellyfish and the various kinds of sea anemone that earned him a precocious fellowship of the Royal Society. So really his name is first made through taxonomy to some extent, but also physiological work on all kinds of invertebrates. But afterwards, by the time he returned to London, T.H. Huxley's zoological expertise turned to vertebrates, to these famous primates. This actually is a photograph of what was called the Bondi skull, which the Australian Museum sent, not the skull, but the photograph of, to Huxley in London. There he was now, not really teaching invertebrates, but researching vertebrates. He had a museum in Jermyn Street connected to a thing called the Museum of Economic Geology. But then later he moved to South Kensington, to that domain where all the museums are at the moment. And there he worked, frankly, with dead animals. He collected and researched and taught from fossils, from skeletons, from embryos. He was quite an important recipient and communicator of the idea of recapitulation, that each embryo recapitulates its evolutionary history in its gestation. Really, the most recently animate things around him were probably the pinned bugs and beetles in the entomology collection, and the preserved mammals and the reptiles and the avian trophies that surrounded him in taxidermied life. He was a specialist as a zoologist in dead animals. And the reason I say that is that his grandson was the exact opposite. So Julian Huxley, as a zoologist, was interested in not lifeless animals, but animals alive, animate and vital. For him, they were best observed alive in wonderful interaction with each other. So far from his grandfather's kind of specialty in dead beasts, Julian Huxley observed behaviour and even emotional relationships, to quote him, between living creatures. He was really an anthropologist or an ethnographer of the animal world, and he was in fact trained earliest as an ethologist, a scholar of animal behaviour. And as many of you will know, his first love was with birds, no doubt about it. Julian's best known zoological work remains still a 1914 article called The Courtship Habits of the Great Crested Grebe. And these are his notes from that famous field work. It's a much cited classic in ethology, and it's the foundation for his study of rituals. Though what he calls rituals, the animal rituals, what do their enchanting dances, these two birds, the male and female, would strike poses, he would say, and they would enact rituals. And he didn't want to just describe these rituals, but actually more like an anthropologist than anything else, if I can put it that way. He sought to understand their meaning for the birds themselves. It was a very important piece because it was an extension of Charles Darwin's other theory of sexual selection. So these water birds, these grebes, unlike Darwin's peacocks, were and are minimally sexually dimorphous, hardly any identifiable distinction between the female and male, and that's what really caught Julian Huxley intellectually. How does sexual selection then work, was his question. Well, then, to think about them both as different kinds of zoologists, I'm very interested in their different contexts as well. Thomas Henry Huxley lived and worked in a museum. Julian Huxley lived and worked in a zoo for much of the late 1930s, and the war years, he literally lived in an apartment in the Regent Park Zoo with his family. And one of my favourite pieces of archival work, you know, archival work can often, as a historian, can be really dull, and then these hilarious things just emerge. So I was going through Julian Huxley's paper, opening a folder, and believe me, there's plenty of dull stuff, but out comes this invoice, and he's dated 1935. He hasn't been in the job 1 week as director of the London Zoological Society, which puts him in the London Zoo, and he's sending an invoice off, you can see here, to Gerard and Sons, who are the great taxidermists, to dress and mount as a rug 1 polar bear skin. So as I read it, the polar bears just died in the London Zoo. Julian Huxley grabs his moment, sends the animal, the dead beast, off to Gerard and Sons and has it dressed, and there are photos of it on the floor in his apartment as one of the perks of being director at the zoo. But incidentally, it's rather a nice invoice, this, because I love that the E. Gerard and Sons, these famous taxidermists, are also naturalists and furriers. So they're also, they do artistic and decorative natural history, educational and nature study preparations, and skin dressing, rugs and furs. So there's that lovely kind of crossover. And I think it's one of those documents that, given that in the audience here there are many distinguished scientists, you have to be careful what you keep in your personal papers when you deposit them to libraries, because historians like me find them much later. So there we have Thomas Henry Huxley in the museum, Julian Huxley ensconced in the zoo, literally living in the zoo, hearing and listening and recording the animals. In his later life, for Julian Huxley, it wasn't Regent's Park actually, but Africa that provided him the context in which to serve as what he called ecologically responsible trustee to animals. So for him, the conservation of African wildlife in situ became a really major project. And it's interesting to put the two of them together in that kind of frame as well, because for his grandfather, Africa was mythic. It was to be found for him only in libraries in the Athenaeum Club or the British Museum, and especially for him that very special African primate, the gorilla, that becomes very famous, but very quickly it's only named, I believe, in the 1850s, and suddenly makes its way into Huxley's discussion in the 1860s. But nobody at that point had ever seen, none of the naturalists had seen a live gorilla, and in fact most of them had only ever seen a gorilla skeleton, not a taxidermied one. So T.H. Huxley's basing an enormous amount of his work on the gorilla and the similarities and difference between the gorilla and Homo sapiens, but in fact he's drawing only from a skeleton and the very few and the suite of drawings that are in the libraries that he's attending. Julian, by contrast, was captivated by, and I want to even say in love with, London Zoo's most famous gorilla, Guy. And this extraordinary photograph is by the the portraitist Wolfgang Schuschwitzky, who took this extraordinary photo of Guy in London Zoo, 1958, and he said that it was his best ever photograph of a lifetime. And he wrote also that Julian Huxley, in whose papers this original photograph lies, loved this photograph as much as he loved the animal himself. But Julian Huxley, who wrote a lot about Guy the gorilla and spent a lot of time in interaction with him, I think in this regard was rather more the intellectual grandson of Charles Darwin than he was of Thomas Henry Huxley, because it was Charles Darwin who was interested in live animals. It was Charles Darwin who took mirrors into the orangutan cage in the 1830s and 40s. It was Charles Darwin who wrote the book, The Expression of Emotion in Animals and Man and Animals, in 1872. So there's a way in which Thomas Henry Huxley was captivated by paleontology, by fossilized animals, by embryos, and by taxidermied animals that he could teach from, and skeletons. His grandson, rather more like Charles Darwin, I think, was much more interested in interactions between human and animals, but especially ethology, interaction between animals themselves. Well, let me talk a little bit about what these zoologists had to say about both nature and culture in this period, and then move on to a little bit about the religious significance of what's going on. Well, two portraits. Again, I'm going to focus on this one here and this one here. Here we have another life shot of Julian in 1947 for Life magazine, and he's holding an Igbo wooden sculpture from Nigeria, which I know that he bought on the cheap in his West African travels in 1943. And he's posing with this for the Life photographer. And he tells us it's a sacred object, a small idol destined for household shrines. And, you know, in fact, it ended up on a shrine there of a very different order. But this is Julian Huxley. He was definitely a student and a lover of nature. He was an inheritor of the idea of agnostics. He was a believer in evolution by natural selection. But as this image is intended to symbolize, he was from the beginning a student inclined to culture, to analyzing rituals, to analyzing behavior in human and animals. But for him, culture was itself part of evolution, and technically so, not just loosely or illustratively. Human minds, he would always argue, human minds are unique in evolutionary terms. He always insisted that, precisely because we can comprehend just that. We, Homo sapiens, are completely different to any other animal, because we can understand our own evolutionary history, he would always say. And incidentally, I mean, he's a very peculiar evolutionary biologist, even by his own times, because he understands He understands evolution as progressive, which of course Charles Darwin never did, and most biologists then and now don't either. So he's quite unusual in that respect. So here we have holder of culture. Here we have holder of nature. His grandfather's image is captured in really heavy oils. This painting and many of T.H. Huxley are in fact by the celebrated portraitist John Collier, happens to be Huxley's son-in-law, Julian's uncle. So this is very much a family affair, this portrait. It's the most famous representation of T.H. Huxley, and he's leaning on books there that ended up on his grandson's shelves. And I think it's an extraordinary image. He's like a sovereign holding an orb. He's claiming the skull of every man. He's like a secular representative of God's dominion on earth, transformed into a secular and agnostic trustee of all humankind. You know, there's no question here that he's presenting himself as the patriarch, not just of one scientific family, but announcing himself as patriarch of science. This cranium here is highly symbolic, and his son-in-law, John Collier, the portraitist, knew that. It's a symbol of Huxley's ascendancy over British natural sciences, his ascendancy over Richard Owen. And it's like, I read it as like a secular kind of talisman of Huxley's great intervention, evidence as to man's place in nature. He's putting humans there in nature. He holds nature. Well, let's just dwell on that cranium for a moment. Many then, but also now, would rightly consider this human remain to be somehow sacred, certainly as sacred as the effigy that Julian held, and perhaps rightly more so because this cranium this human remain was a human, not just a representation of one, which is what Julian's holding. Huxley, the grandfather, comprehended nothing of the sort. He would never have understood this cranium as in any sense sacrosanct. Neither in death nor in life was for him the human body the receptacle of a soul. At least we can never show that to be the case. That's his agnostics. He battled his whole life for nature, for the strictly scientific method to understand it. And so the modernization of natural sciences, of which he was really a key player, challenged fundamentally the idea of knowing anything about the soul, of knowing the sacred, of knowing the magical, of knowing the supernatural. There are no spirits, no creator, at least none of which we can be sure, he said over and over again. Wonderful, I imagine him as saying, had he lived long enough to read one of the great scholarly debates of the modern world about secularization, especially over the 20th century. Library upon library upon library explaining a thesis of secularization from a religious world to a supposedly secular one. He would have loved it. But I think he also would have wondered why, in the next breath, why his biologist grandson, living in the high 20th century, was so drawn by sacred idols. Why his biologist grandson, Julian Huxley, studied parapsychology. Why his biologist grandson, Julian Huxley, occasionally wondered out loud about ghosts. Why his literary grandson, Aldous, sought radically other perceptions and doors to them. Not to mention, and this has turned out to be my favourite Huxley of all, not to mention the strangest of outcomes with his anthropologist great-grandson, Francis Huxley, Julian's son, Francis, who became so hopelessly immersed in the magical and the mystical, in voodoo, in rituals of sacralization, to become himself described as a high animist. This is the great-grandson of the person who wrote Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature and invented the term agnostics. So one trajectory of this intimate history of evolution, according to the thesis of secularization or disenchantment, as it's often called, it should be a story from a kind of a victory story of Huxley's rational agnostics in the 19th century through a dynasty of scientists, where that gets increasingly underlined. But in fact, it's a story of the opposite. We've got the agnostic in the 19th century. Through the 20th century, we have Julian Huxley, who's really more so enchanted by a kind of a thinking through nature to another world, that he's more like a neo-romantic scientist than he is anything else, complete with visions that he writes about, complete with poetry. He's a neo-romantic scientist as the grandson, of the great rationalist, the scientific naturalist of the 19th century. But even more so, we have this wonderful anthropologist, entirely quirky, may yet turn out to be recognized as the best writer of the lot of them, I think, including Aldous, Francis Huxley. So really it's a story of re-enchantment of the Huxleys than anything else. Well, if we remember the cranium that Thomas Henry Huxley holds so confidently with such propriety, we know that he knew that a particular human used to be in this skull, used to be it. It once held a brain, a mind, a consciousness, a human being, even if for T.H. Huxley that was a soulless one. But none of that meant that this scientist, this biologist, was disinterested in human feeling. On the contrary, consciousness and perception, sense and sensation was really fascinating to him as a physiologist, but also, perhaps more importantly, as a learned philosopher of mind. He was not just a comparative anatomist. He was a relentless inquirer into brain and mind inside that human skull, how that brain and mind senses and thinks and perceives and feels, and does so differently to and similarly from other kinds of animals. By Julian's early adulthood, this particular Huxley inquiry about consciousness and unconsciousness had shifted from T.H. Huxley's world, his interest in mesmerism and hypnosis and anesthesia and reflex, to analysis of a new phenomenon in the 20th century called uppercase U, the unconscious. Julian Huxley absolutely consumed Sigmund Freud. And here we have these extraordinary Huxley brothers, Julian on the left of the image and Aldous Huxley on the right of the image. I think of them as the talker and the listener. These two extraordinary Huxley brothers by the 1950s and 60s, as we have them here, they're actively wondering together about not just the kind of consciousness and philosophy of mind of their grandfather, but about altering consciousness and perception through any number of mechanisms, through telepathy, through Indian meditation, through Vedanta, with mescaline and with LSD. The brother on the left here, who lived in cosy and safe Hampstead Heath, was a philosopher of new kinds of human perception, at one remove from all of this. The brother on the right here, who lived in edgy California for much of his adult life, was a practitioner, if I can put it that way, fully immersed in experimental experience as well as reflection upon that in his later life. Well, what becomes really poignant here is that the Huxleys are not just thinkers of minds, even experimentalists of minds. That skull, that brain, that mind turns out to be not just their scholarly business, but their suffering as well. The Huxleys were deeply afflicted by mental illness over many generations. If I can put it this way, the Huxley collective depression was only matched by the family capacity to think about it, and in highly curious ways, to be really intrigued by the mysterious relationship between mind and body inside those skulls, outside those skeletons. And I should say here that for neither Thomas Henry Huxley nor Julian Huxley were their depressions ever fully hidden or sequestered. So there is no sense in which what I'm about to say is an expose. It's drawn from published material as much as unpublished. But they really are extraordinary men because they achieved great stature in the world of science and in the communication of science. Despite, on occasion, their minds and their bodies slowing almost to a standstill. Sometimes Julian Huxley's soul, if I can put it that way, was all but too heavy to bear. His affliction was dreaded and it was terrible. He was an accomplished poet himself. In fact, they all were. But when Julian Huxley was unable to gather any words coherently to describe anything, let alone the pain of his depression, he would often reach for the words of others. And he would confess publicly how his mind and his soul in depression were tortured. He said, "I lived Walt Whitman's terrible words," quote, "hell under the skull bones, death under the breastbones." The family is in fact a family, and I write a lot about them in the book, as actually a family of poets, a family of letters, as much as a family of scientists. But really the family's most famous wordsmith is Aldous Huxley, of course. And he landed on a surprising word altogether that I've become quite enchanted with to describe this family affliction. The word is axidy, and it comes from Chaucer's Middle English. It comes from Aldous Huxley's beloved English canon, this word axidy. And he says that this is a condition that Chaucer writes, "forsloweth and forsluggeth a man." Axidy works to forsloweth and forsluggeth a man. And this, Aldous Huxley says, is what passed from Thomas Henry to his grandsons, 2 grandsons at least, and what spread here and there and was inherited across the wider Huxley family. There's the grandfather and the grandson. One of the few portraits of them together, and I think it's a very poignant one because Julian Huxley is, as a youngster there, is kind of softly seeking and claiming his grandfather's hands, and in fact through his whole life he grafted himself very much onto his father's scientific lineage, but also inherited from his grandfather this great difficulty. However, what agonized Julian Huxley personally fascinated him intellectually. What do we inherit and what inheres in us, he would say? What happens over and between generations of living beings? How is similarity and variation carried forward over time? How is that measured in generational years of a family tree and in tens of thousands of years in the tree of man, which his grandfather's generation had kind of invented? What do we really know about breeding was Julian Huxley's question, alongside that extraordinary generation of evolutionary biologists. What do we know about breeding of peas or pigeons, of horses or humans? So for me, it's been really interesting to write about a family history of the Huxleys, which doubles also as an account of evolving ideas about generations and genealogy and genes and eugenics. Well, the Huxleys, like generations of Huxleys, like generations of Darwins, were very involved in eugenics. And the more you know about eugenics and the more you know about the history of biology, I suppose, this is less and less surprising. once Julian Huxley's generation had done that kind of synthesis of Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection, they were really interested to put it alongside the idea of improving human individuals, improving human nations, improving human race, by which they sometimes meant species and sometimes meant race as division of the human species. I have to say that Thomas Henry Huxley was not entirely sure about this ambition to improve future humans. He was quite cautious, but Julian Huxley was 100% sure. Well, what I want to show you just quickly is this this very well-known image of eugenics from 1921, I think it is. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And it's a very well, many of you will have seen this before, it's a very well, often published tree, intellectual tree of knowledge. And I always think it's really ironic, kind of not ironic, but dismal actually, because the biblical tree of knowledge holds evil within it, of course. And as we know, the eugenic tree of knowledge, you know, by the time this was drawn, it had already brought great evil on many people. But the reason I like it with respect to the Huxleys is less the eugenics, although that's, you know, that's interesting enough, but more all of these intellectual roots, which I think many of us in the Royal Society will identify with more than one of them. But I often think that this could have been commissioned by the Huxley family, the great polymaths who over the 19th and 20th century bring all of these human and natural sciences together. And for me, it explains very much what's going on between letters and sciences, but especially between human sciences and natural sciences that we think get joined in 1970s sociobiology, but in fact that's mythic. They're joined all the way through, and we can see here on your left of the screen, you know, anatomy and physiology, which is really Thomas Henry Huxley's medical training, psychology and genetics. Enter eugenics, mental testing and anthropometry. There's a kind of a measuring cluster of roots, intellectual roots there. History and geology form anthropology, which is really interesting. Ethnology and geography are together. Law, politics, statistics. So that someone at some point imagined this all flourishing into eugenics, which is a kind of a momentary 1920s to 1950s probably joining of human sciences and natural sciences in a way that, we can spend a long time in a kind of an expose of it. But, I've written about eugenics for so long, but I've come to be much more interested in kind of de-exceptionalizing eugenics. And Julian Huxley here is very interesting because he was one of the first and loudest opponents, soon after this design here, the first and loudest opponents of Nazi eugenics. After the war, one of the great opponents of racist use of various biological theses. He is very hard to understand because after the war, he also becomes the president of the Eugenics Society. And in fact, he never, right to the day he died in 1975, he never abandons the term eugenics. He understands the Nazi use of it, the German use of it, to be an entire misunderstanding and misuse of eugenics. But he felt that the human biological and political future would be enhanced by taking on eugenics, to the extent that he wrote eugenics into his manifesto for his philosophical manifesto for UNESCO in 1946. So for him, there was no disjuncture between his anti-racist work and his presidency and his proponent, his active work as proponent of eugenics. Well, let me wrap up. These Huxleys, they dealt with life on Earth in every scale imaginable, which is why I love them so much. I love these big thinkers of the past. They dealt with life on Earth on every scale, from the solar system to the soul, in orders of scale that were massive and microscopic, minute. They were masters at communicating how the smallest matter of nature fitted into the whole, and the bigger the whole, the better for them. Evolution and human knowledge of it was everything. Julian proposed especially. He said in the mid-1960s, evolutionary science has its roots in cosmology and its flowering, he said, in human history. The grandfather had compiled evidence as to man's place in nature in 1863, and he kind of looked backward to evolutionary past that was receding. Time was receding before his very eyes with every paleontological discovery. A century later, his grandson considered the future of man, evolutionary aspects, was an essay he wrote in 1963. And Julian Huxley, by temperament, by training, looked from his present forward. He looked into the future. He thought in 1963 that he was in a crucial moment in the cosmic story, he said. But he was so far kind of in nature as a human, and a clever one, as to be, he would say, in charge of it, to have a kind of a dominion over nature. Excuse me. He said man's destiny is to be the sole agent for the future evolution of this planet. They, we, he said, stand alone as trustees of evolution. Thank you.
Alison, that was stunning. It was a very different talk to the one that I thought you might have given, and I'm sitting here waiting for a flurry of questions. So while they're all coming, I'll ask one of myself. I have always seen the Huxley-Darwin, this is Thomas Huxley and Darwin, if you like, their synthesis as being a very interesting evolution, used in a different way, of relationships that came out of two very important attachments to the rattlesnake with Huxley and the beagle with Darwin. And it was a very interesting difference to what had been going on, because the English had very much focused around botany, initiated by a very powerful person in Joseph Banks. The French had expanded their Enlightenment ideas through their interest in anthropology in the Pacific. And then along came Darwin on the beagle and Huxley on the rattlesnake. And they both moved in a very different direction. And my question, Alison, is to what extent do you think there's a collective input from those experiences for several years, you know, stuck with a pretty rude and ready crew, looking at depths of oceans and various cartographic coordinates. And here they were having different roles and functions, and yet they took from that this extraordinary convergence of interest in the development and evolution of nature. So do you think, what's your thoughts on that particular experience?
Thanks, Robert. I hope I stop coughing. And I can recommend to everybody Ian McCalman's fabulous book, Darwin's Armada, that does exactly that, that tracks the Beagle journey and Huxley's and two others in our part of the world.
All right, right.
Darwin's Armada, of course, it's really super. So, you know, I'm not sure it's that different, actually, with the beagle and the rattlesnake. I mean, what they're building on is already, it doesn't go, I don't think, Robert, from botany to, you know, invertebrates and vertebrates. Although the shift from Banks forward is, because Banks has that great botanical interest. But really the beagle, Darwin on the beagle and T.H. Huxley on the rattlesnake and the MacGillivray, the official naturalist, they're following on from von Humboldt's great journeys. They're following on from, in the very same oceans, they're following on from a lot of French expeditions earlier in the century. They're following on from, you know, d'Entrecasteaux, D'Urville, and they're following the work, you know, Napoleon, in the Napoleonic era, he's sending a lot of French into the South Seas. And these are people who are scooping up the same kind of jellyfish and looking at them and wondering how to put them in the taxonomy and how they do and don't, you know, fit with 18th century taxonomy. So in a way, I think of them as following on, especially those earlier French journeys. And some of those journeys are to the very, you know, they're around Van Diemen's Land and they go up to the Torres Strait and they're literally scooping jellyfish and surface invertebrates and looking at them. And I think that Julian Huxley actually said that, you know, we know with Darwin that the information that he's gathering on the Beagle journey is already taking shape as he's wondering about biogeography and the differences and the variations, and it's starting to take shape as an extension of his grandfather's evolutionism, you know. But with Huxley, that's not what's going on with Thomas Henry Huxley. And actually Julian says, I don't think my grandfather was an evolutionist at all until probably about the 1870s. And that's a hard thing to understand. But really, we need to think of Thomas Henry Huxley on the rattlesnake, and that's 1840s, late to 1850, let's say, mid-1840s to 1850. And he's really working as a kind of a physiologist, working with the new phenomenon of the microscope. He's looking at cells. He's working out the two-layered cell theory. He's wondering how he taxonomizes. He's more than a taxonomist, but he's wondering about all of these invertebrates and how badly they're actually categorized. He's not really thinking about their evolutionary history or their descent from common ancestors, certainly not. And so he's not, in a weird way, he's not a precocious Darwinist. And in fact, many scholars of Thomas Henry Huxley wondered whether he was a Darwinist at all. And his letters with Charles Darwin, and I'll end here, his letters with Charles Darwin show that although Thomas Henry Huxley is very much an evolutionist, he's not easily persuaded by a natural selection version of evolution. And that's what Julian Huxley means when he says, I don't think my grandfather was a Darwinist until about 1870s. It took a long time. And in fact, he never entertained sexual selection.
Fascinating.
Marion, I think, thank you, asked what did he do in the wars, by which I mean, I think you mean Julian. And so he went to Rice, took an odd position at Rice University, which was not yet even built. It was even Rice Institute in Houston, Texas in 1912. Greatly disturbed establishment of zoology there, disturbed by his depressions. And then by 1915, his aunt, Mary Augusta Ward, who published as Mrs. Humphrey Ward, his aunt essentially shamed him to return, wrote a very shaming letter, why aren't you contributing to the war? He returns and does work actually in intelligence in World War I. World War II is in some ways more interesting. And his brother Aldous was both almost blind, and so wouldn't have been selected into the troops in World War I, but in fact was a pacifist, not formally a conscientious objector, but avoided it in any case. In World War II, Julian Huxley was director of the zoo. And he had a bit of a habit of going AWOL when he took up these positions. And he was invited to do a lecture a lecture series in the States, interestingly, in the middle of the war, and he went to the US in wartime and spent about 3 years there. But he was actually living in the zoo in the Blitz, and he writes very movingly and interestingly and actually amusingly of the bunker that they had to build in the Regent's Park Zoo, but also on the declaration of war. He had his staff kill the venomous animals. So a lot of snakes were killed, a whole lot of spiders were killed, a whole lot of scorpions were killed. He removed the very large, dangerous animals. Some of the tigers were killed. He removed a lot of the large and dangerous animals, elephants and some of the big cats especially, to Whipsnade Zoo, the kind of large area outside London where they were kept. But he in fact did quite a lot of, ordered his keepers to kill a lot of the animals, so that if and when the bombs did drop, which they did right on the zoo, that the animals wouldn't be creating even more havoc. So it's a kind of a really idiosyncratic World War II. But he writes beautifully actually about a whole lot of his intellectual friends lived adjacent to Regent's Park, and quite a few of them would come into the bunker in the zoo with him, and there they would talk about everything from communism to ecology. So there's a lovely moment where he said he has JBS Haldane himself, Alexander Carr Saunders, who was director of London School of Economics at that point, and also Joseph Needham, the chemist. They were all in a bunker together for some time, solving many problems. So very idiosyncratic wartime.
Two questions that have suddenly popped up, Alison. The first is from a father of a fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, who's extremely disappointed because he hadn't heard anything about Andrew Huxley, who he described as a mere Nobel laureate and master of Trinity, Cambridge. Can we hear something about Andrew Huxley, please?
Yes, Andrew, that's the summary of Andrew Huxley. Andrew Huxley was Julian Huxley's half-brother. And he was indeed a mere Nobel laureate and indeed a mere president of the Royal Society and a mere master of Trinity College. I'm extremely aware that there are many eminent Huxleys. It took a long time for me to decide to focus on this pair. I am Andrew Huxley's work himself and his own family recollections are very important, including, I have to say, a very important lecture that he gave on Julian Huxley, which he called The Family View. So there's no question that Andrew Huxley is, of course, in some ways, a very direct, intellectually direct grandson to T.H. Huxley, not least because nerves and physiology of nerves was something that they both worked very closely on, not least because they were both presidents of the Royal Society at various times. Nonetheless, for me, deciding not to write about the entire Huxley family, but pairing Thomas Henry and Julian, because they were cosmologists of sorts, because they were both science communicators in a way that Andrew Huxley never was. That's the pairing over the 19th and 20th century that I've chosen to do in this particular book. And it was quite, the rest of the family comes in and out of my story very much. And Andrew Huxley certainly does. Aldous Huxley does a great deal. As I've said, one of the interesting things for me has been to write about the Huxleys, not just as men of science, but definitely as men of letters as well. They all wrote and published distinguished poetry.
That's, look, one other question I'd like to ask you, Alison, and that is from Ian Wilkinson, who is intrigued to know whether David Attenborough would acknowledge Julian Huxley as a mentor. Was there a relationship between the two?
There was. It's a great question. Yes, there was. And in his several or many autobiographies and his reflections on making nature history documentaries, it's not uncommon for him to note that he started life behind the camera with Julian Huxley. And David Attenborough made a very early, I can't quite date them off the top of my head, zoo series that really is a 1950s version of what Julian Huxley had done in the 1930s. But more than that, and rather touching actually, I've read the letters that David Attenborough wrote to Julian Huxley's widow, Juliet Huxley, after the death of Julian. And they are very clear that Julian Huxley was someone to whom he looked as a precursor in the field of nature, filmmaking and communicating zoology. But more, perhaps even more interestingly, David Attenborough wrote Juliet Huxley in 1975 a letter where he said he was most inspired as a young boy by reading The Science of Life. And that was the book, in fact, more than a book, it's 3 volumes, that H.G. Wells and Julian Huxley and H.G. Wells' son, G.P. Wells, 3 of them, wrote together in the late 1920s. And it was published as it's really holds up as the first biology textbook, kind of a textbook, written from the new discipline of ecology. So it's interested in systems. And it's a very, very important book, widely published, widely read. And David Attenborough says to Juliet Huxley on, decades later, it was from reading Science of Life as a boy that I, first became interested in zoology and the communication of it.
Well, that's terrific. You've actually answered the final question I had here, Alison, which was what was the relationship between Wells and Huxley. So I think given time, we may move on. And it's my terrific pleasure to thank you for what I think is one of the greatest talks I've heard for a long time, certainly one of the highlights of the Royal Society over a long period. Everyone can understand why Alison is my very favourite historian. Alison has the capacity to blend history with science, to throw in a touch of mythology, to actually take a name and give it an idea and give the idea a sense of reality. And Alison, you've done that so well. What I thought was fascinating tonight was that you didn't talk about what I thought you'd talk about, and that is this centralisation around Darwin and how, in a supportive way, you actually made the Huxleys the main players. Yeah. And that I think is not something that, while I think it's merited and is the right way to go, it's not an easy thing to do when you've got a towering figure like Darwin that sort of overwhelms them in a way. So it's my pleasure to thank you on behalf of the Royal Society, Alison, for a stunning and memorable talk, which I'm sure will generate a lot of discussion. And as you said, it could be done in chapters, and maybe that's what we should be asking you. I'm a bit of an ex-neurologist, so I can understand why poor old Huxley didn't get a Guernsey, but maybe next time. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Robert. I'll come in just in the last couple of minutes and thank you for conducting the Q&A while you're overcoming technical difficulties with great skill. And to say, Alison, you are a worthy recipient of the Royal Society of New South Wales History and Philosophy of Science Medal, which is awarded each year to recognise outstanding achievement in the history and philosophy of science, with preference being given to the study of ideas, institutions and individuals of significance to the practice of the natural sciences. And I think that your lecture tonight really demonstrates why you have been awarded that medal. I thought you'd be interested to know that your lecture is the very first to be tweeted as an event by the Royal Society of New South Wales. We activated our Twitter account yesterday, and the Twitter handle describes the society as a 200-year-old learned society dedicated to the public interdisciplinary discussion of important matters in the science and humanities. So what better person to embody those sentiments than you tonight. So thank you very much. I think everyone should give Alison a virtual clap.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert, and or everybody there. And I think that I'd also like to thank all of the people who've given up their evening to listen. Really grateful.